In order to understand the physiology of the systems, as we discussed in the first lecture, we need to have a good understanding of the cells. And also to understand the cells, and we're going to spend a lot of time on cells, it's very important for you to understand also the chemistry, the basic chemistry. I know chemistry is a prerequisite for this course. And of course, you're not responsible for every single concept you learned about in chemistry. To be fair to you, some of you had chemistry last semester, while others had chemistry 5 years ago. Some of you had chemistry with someone where you consider it was a great experience. Some of you may not consider your chemistry a great experience. So what I'm trying to say, even though the chemistry is prerequisite, I don't expect you to rely on previous knowledge. What I am going to do, I'm going to be discussing with you the chemistry that I expect you to know, that I want you to know. Granted, for this part, I may go a bit quick because you've had it before. So whatever I'm referring to when it comes to the chemistry, and I'll specify it in a bit, if it's something you know very well, great, you're done. If not, well, go back and review it. Your textbook, chapter 2, have a lot of resources, also a lot of explanation when it comes to the chemistry. And you'll see some things you need to know generally, some things you need to know in more details. Now, why am I looking at the chemistry? Why do I expect you to study the chemistry? Because the chemistry is a part of the cell, is a major component of cells. Cells are made of chemicals, and you need to understand it. What is our goal in this class? Our goal is to understand how the human body functions, right? So this is something very important to know, and we're going to be doing that understanding in a hierarchy of organization. What I mean by hierarchy of organizations, different levels, going from chemistry, molecules, to cells, to tissues, to organ, and all the way to the biosphere. So kind of like this right here. If I show you this, what are you looking at right now? Obviously, you're looking at planet Earth from space. What do you see right now? You see blue and brown stuff, right? If you're an alien from out of space, I mean, that's the only thing you can make. Oh, it's a sphere. It's brown, blue. What is that, right? So in order for you to answer what is that, what do you need to do? You need to zoom in further, right? So if I were to zoom in on this picture, and now with Google Earth, you can see all these amazing features. So now it got better. I still see blue, but now I see more features. Obviously, I'm seeing buildings, I'm seeing flat structures, I'm seeing areas with no structures. Let's zoom further. And when I zoom further, these tall structures are building. These flat structures are houses. And these things that look like they don't have anything turned out to be not only roads, turned out to be they have tiny structures in them. Let's zoom on this further. I see these structures are more detailed, more specific. And let's zoom further. I see now what those things on the roads look like. obviously they're cars. And if I zoom further, oh, I see now a new level. I see people. You get the idea? What I'm trying to show you here? Looking at this only does not give you the whole picture. Looking at this only gives you more details, but not the whole picture. Not the whole picture, not the whole picture, and so on. You get the idea. So I want to use that concept to understand the physiology. Our goal is to understand the human body. Here I see someone running. Obviously, you've seen runners. They're moving their muscles. They're looking around. They're breathing. Their heart is beating. I want to dissect this to the maximum. I want to look at everything. So where do I start? I start at the simplest. And what is the simplest in this case? Atoms. And this is why I said, chemistry is a prerequisite for this class. This is what I was referring to, that you need to know about the chemistry, the basics. And if you remember atoms, not if you remember, please tell me that this is something you still remember from chemistry. Because if you don't, then I would classify it as something that it wasn't of a great experience for you. But remember, we call this matter. All matter, living and non-living, are made of atoms. And I'll get to that in a second. If you remember, there's a periodic table. There are 100 different atoms. And of course, our goal is not to kind of do it like we did in chemistry, periods, group, all this stuff. No, I'm going to tell you what we need to know. But remember, atoms interact together to form molecules. What is a molecule? The definition of a molecule is a group of atoms that have a common function. Or the group of atoms, maybe I should say it better, a group of atoms that interact together to form a molecule that have a specific function. And remember, this is not chemistry of everything. This is the biochemistry, chemistry of our body. And there are so many molecules that make up our body, from the highest amount, water, to H2O, obviously, to many, many different molecules. How big is a molecule? And I know you remember that from chemistry. H2O, 3 atoms, 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. HCO3, minus a hydrogen, a carbon, and 3 oxygen. So molecules typically are made of a certain number of atoms. But what is that certain number? 3, 5, 10, 20. Maybe, for example, a larger molecule, 30 atoms. I'm really stretching it, right? And there are so many different molecules. However, there are specific types of molecules. We call them macromolecules. Macro. And the reason why we use the term macro, what does the word macro mean? Large. So here we're talking about molecules made of thousands, yes, you heard right, thousands of atoms, all connected together. 5,000, 3,000, 500, 2,000 atoms connected together. And while I said there are so many different molecules, when it comes to macromolecules, and this is something we're going to emphasize extensively in this class, when it comes to macromolecules, there are 4 of them. Only 4 that you need to know so well, that you need to understand extremely well. And those four macromolecules, which are the main focus of the course, and I'm going to spend about an hour on them, at least, to discuss them. Those are carbohydrates, the sugar, the nucleic acids, like DNA, the proteins, self-explanatory, and the lipids, the fats. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. If you did not get them, don't worry. I'm going to have in a bit actually, I'm going to have a lot of information about those. Why do we need these macromolecules? Because they are what constitute cells, what make up cells. What is a cell? Cell has a unique definition in biology. We call it the smallest unit of life. And here I want to underline the word life. Alive. I'm using PowerPoint and I'm writing with a mouse, so excuse the horrible handwriting. Life. What does it mean to be alive? You know, biologists agree on certain characteristics of life. One of them, metabolism, chemical reactions, activities. One of them, reproduction. Life gives life. One of them, growth. One of them, development. So those are the characteristics of life. Respond to the environment. Responding, changing to the environment. So cells are considered the smallest units of life. The smallest units of life. What do I mean by the cells being the smallest unit of life? It means their activity gives us life. And if I were to ask you how many cells make up the human body? How many cells? Remember, cells are microscopic, or most of them are microscopic. How many cells make up the human body? You're going to say a lot. How much is a lot? 100 trillion cells. What's a trillion? A huge number, obviously, 100 trillion. So many different cells make up our body. Now, if I were to ask you a different question, how many different types of cells make up our body? What I mean by different types of cells, meaning a skin cell, stomach cell, muscle cell, heart cell, lung cell, and so on. How many cells are we talking about here? You should know the answer. I mean, you're playing it probably in your head right now, about 200 different cells that make up our body, and we're going to be discussing those cells. In anatomy, you learned that a group of cells that have a common function, we call them tissue. And there are 4 different types of tissues. I'm sure you remember them like the back of your hand: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Even though a group of cells make up a tissue, you'll be so saddened and disappointed to hear that we are not going to discuss tissues in this class. You've done a lot in anatomy, that's sufficient. But why are we studying tissues? Because a group of tissues make up an organ. Your stomach is an organ, your heart is an organ, your lungs are organs, your blood vessels are displayed in this picture as an organ. And a group of organs that have a common function, we call that an organ system. And you've learned that in anatomy, we're going to use the same approach in phys. There are 11 different organ systems: the muscular system, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the immune system, and so on. We're going to be studying all the systems later on. We're going to be skipping or not discussing, doesn't apply much in phys, the integumentary system, the skin. We're not going to be studying this. The skeletal system, the bones, we're not going to be studying this. But we're going to be focusing or studying every single other system. So if you put all these systems together, organ systems together, what do you have? You have the actual organism, the human body that we're trying to understand. So let me ask you this very important question. Which one is important out of everything I outlined for you, that level of organization or the hierarchy of organization? Which one should you understand to understand the human body? The answer is all of them. Every single one is important. And this is the approach we're going to be using in this class. This is the part that we are going to study in this class. So what I am going to do, I'm going to delete this. What I am going to do is spend about a week discussing the chemistry. I need you to have a good understanding of the chemistry, because if you do, then everything will become easier to comprehend. So we're going to spend some time on this. Then I'm going to spend about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, discussing cells. We need to understand how cells work. Not from the aspect you learned about in anatomy. Oh, a cell has a Golgi apparatus, a cell has a ribosome, a cell has a mitochondria. No. We're going to look at the physiology of the cell, not the anatomy of the cell. So we're going to spend about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks on cells. And then we'll move on for the remainder of the semester to study the organ system. And of course, when we study the organ system, we're learning about organs. And in order for us to understand the organ system, we have to have a very good understanding of cells. For example, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the nervous system. But to understand how the nervous system works, you want to understand how each individual cell works. So we're going to be focusing on the neurons. To understand how the muscles work, you want to understand how a single muscle cell works. So you're going to have a lot of understanding of how a muscle cell function, how a stomach cell function, and so on. So we're going to be using the system, we're going to be looking at organs, we're going to keep coming back to cells. And to understand cells, you need to understand the macromolecules. So everything is tied in together. And obviously, I'm spending 1 week on the chemistry, supposedly a prerequisite course you've had already, but I'm spending time on it because I want everyone to start fresh. I want everything, regardless of their experience, regardless of how much they remember. You want to have a good understanding of the chemistry, because we need to understand the chemistry to be able to understand cells. And once we understand cells, we need to spend a lot of time to understand the organ system. So we're going to be looking at this in lots of details. So let's start with the chemistry. Remember the periodic table? Remember the different atoms. What do they call them? The metals, the non-metals, the groups, the periods. We really don't care about this. We want to have a very simple, basic understanding of the chemistry of the atom. And if you look at a periodic table, there are about a little bit below 100 different elements. Out of those 92 that make up all matter, living or non-living, there are about 25 essential ones. We call them essential because they constitute our body. And they're very important to obtain and to have in our cells. And out of these 25 essential, there are 4 that constitute 96% of our body. Can you guess what those 4 are? Oh, here they are. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. And as you know, when we talk about the chemistry, and this is the part that I'm gonna rush as I go through it, I'm gonna make it very quick. Again, if you're with me, you know it, great. If not, we don't need to discuss it in physiology. Go back to your chemistry books or look it up to understand it, and I'm sure you do. I mean, my main goal from showing you the periodic table, from showing you the chemistry, is to understand chemical bonds. Because remember, atoms form molecules, and molecules stick together by chemical bonds. And those chemical bonds, we'll talk about them, they're based on electron interaction. If you recall from chemistry, every atom made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And this is how we classify them in the periodic table. They are placed, the atoms are placed in the periodic table from left to right based on their atomic number, the number of protons, and based on their mass, which is the number of protons and neutrons. And I'm sure you know, every atom have a specific symbol to refer to. And my goal again is to eventually, going over this quick, my goal is for you to understand what a covalent bond is. Every chemical bond is referred to as electrostatic interaction, an attraction between a positive and a negative. Protons are positive. Electrons are negative. So it's about that interaction, and some interaction is very strong, which makes it a strong bond. Some interaction is less strong, makes it less of a strong bond or a bit weaker bond. So there is covalent bond, which is basically sharing of electrons. Ionic bond, which is an interaction between a positive ion and a negative ion. There is hydrogen bonds, the major part that make up water, the major bond that make up water. It's weaker. And lastly, there is van der Waals interaction, the interaction between two molecules that are not polar. So hydrogen, van der Waals is the weakest, hydrogen is weak, covalent and ionic are both strong, depending on the type of atom, depending on the type of molecule. In certain instances, covalent is stronger than ionic. In other instances, ionic is stronger than covalent. So this is an important slide that I'd like you to know. And I'm including some stuff here. It is available in the PowerPoint I'm posting on Canvas for you to look at to know. Now, in chemistry, you learned about something, an important concept, which is polar and non-polar. Polar molecule, when you have an unequal sharing of electrons when it comes to covalent bonds. Non-polar when it comes to equal sharing. Now, while polar and non-polar, again, I'm going over this a bit quick, some concepts about ionic bonds. While polar and non-polar are important concepts in chemistry, I want to discuss with you something very important, and that is the way we classify molecules in our body. Molecules, because water represents, this is an important slide, and notice some of the chemistry I'm kind of going through them very quickly. Okay, know the basics. Some I'm stopping and I'm saying this is an important slide for you to know. So obviously this is another important one, because water constitutes about 60% of our body. Water represents 60% of our body. We tend to classify every single molecule there is in our body to be either water soluble, we call this hydrophilic, water soluble, or water insoluble, we call this hydrophobic. So hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And notice, these are the terms you learned in chemistry. Polar goes synonymously with hydrophilic. Non-polar goes synonymously with hydrophobic. So you need to know these definitions. Again, hydrophilic means water soluble. Hydrophobic means water insoluble. So those are important definitions for you to know. So this is how we classify all the molecules in our body. And remember, when I say molecules, there are so many. I don't expect you to remember 500 of them. Water, obviously, you know about that. And then I'm going to be focusing on the 4 macromolecules. Remember, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So I mentioned polar, hydrophilic, non-polar, hydrophobic. So every single molecule in our body, every single macromolecule in our body is either water soluble, hydrophilic, or water insoluble, hydrophobic. However, there are certain molecules that are very large in size, that part of that molecule is water soluble, part of that molecule is water insoluble. So is it hydrophilic or hydrophobic? It's both. So we call these kind of molecules, and there are a couple of them, what constitutes our plasma membrane. I'll get to that later. We call these kind of molecules, we call them amphipathic molecules. So what is the definition of an amphipathic molecule? A molecule that is hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Part of it is hydrophilic, part of it is hydrophobic. Very important molecules. So kind of they act like an adapter to join hydrophilic molecules with hydrophobic molecules. We call this amphipathic molecules. So something very important. And remember, we started this discussion because water constitutes about 60% of our body. So make sure they have a nice explanation in the book. In chapter 2, you are responsible for the reading. They discuss water as well. So make sure you look at that section. Obviously, water exists as solid, liquid, and gas, has a lot of specific characteristics that you'd want to be familiar with. One of the very important thing about water in our body, and I'm going to come back to that later when we get to cells, water represents 60% of our body, right? Where is water found inside your body? How many of you, as you are walking, or you're sitting right now, you're dripping water? No, right? Water is sealed in a way, because we sweat, obviously, inside your body. Can you tell me where water is found? Where is that 60% found? It's found in 3 places. It is found in your blood vessels, in the blood. 90% of your blood is actually water. It is found inside your cells. We call this the cytosol, if you recall. And then it is found around the cells in a fluid that we call interstitial fluid. You're like, what? I need to write this down? It's okay. I'm going to talk about that later in more details. So water is found everywhere, but one very important quality of water that we care about, we refer to it as a solvent, meaning it dissolves. It dissolves what? It dissolves every single ion in your body. It dissolves the majority of molecules in the body. It dissolves a lot of the large molecules in your body, so we refer to it as a solvent of life. And it's a media we use to transfer substances. Your blood travels, carry nutrients, carry oxygen. Where is that oxygen found? Well, some of it is dissolved. It dissolves so many different ions. So water, we refer to it as a solvent of life. That's a very important quality. Notice here the water properties. Some of them I'm emphasizing more than others. Another important property of water is that it stores a lot of heat. So we use it as a way to regulate our temperature. Remember, we talked about homeostasis in the previous lecture, how vasoconstriction, vasodilation, how we sweat to release heat, how we vasoconstrict the blood vessels in our skin to preserve heat. So it is actually a way to preserve our body temperature, something very important. And the obviously, it exists in multiple states. We rely a lot on water, even though we do have some vapor in our body. You'll see that effect in the respiratory system later on. We don't have bears inside our body. Luckily, we never have ice inside our body, so that would be very bad. But the majority is the water solubility. This is very important. And another thing I want you to look at is the acid bases, the acidity, which is simply the amount of hydrogen ions in a solution. We use a logarithmic scale called pH scale, if you recall. If you talk about pH in chemistry, in a chemistry lab, you've done these experiments, you can set up the pH that you want. In our body, we have a range of pH, only a small range. One, which is in your stomach, that's the only place in your body where you have a very high acidity, stomach acid, and the blood. So the two major blood and interstitial fluid. So the two major pH values that you'd want to be familiar with, your stomach, which is pH 1, something very important to control, and another place is your blood, which is about a pH of 7.4, human blood, 7.4. That's an important number to know. Around your cells, also interstitial fluid, 7.4. Most of your cells, 7.4. And you're going to realize later why pH is very important. Because, well, you'll see that later. So, again, read in the book about pH, familiarize yourselves with it. I'm not going to give you a specific concentration and ask you to calculate the pH. This is not the concept that I want you to know, but I'd like you to have a good understanding of pH. Level of acidity, again, the stomach, the majority of our body, 7.4. We do have some places where it becomes basic. So make sure also you know the range of pH. What does it mean to be acidic? What does it mean to be basic? What does it mean to be neutral, like pure distilled water is neutral? So this is something good to know. So great. I told you, I'm gonna skip this. Eventually, I want to get to the hierarchy of organization, and I want to get to the macromolecules. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, this is a physiology course. Why do I need to understand atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, bonds, all this neat stuff? Or is it a need? Because it really helps us to understand your body. After all, we are made of chemistry. And I'm going to give you some applications of things that your body or you use in your daily life, which you may not have known is based on chemistry. For example, the pH scale is very important. Your stomach pH is 1, which is highly acidic. 1 is a very strong pH. That is an irritant. And luckily, in our body, the acidity of the stomach is contained in the stomach and is tolerable in the stomach. So great. We don't even feel it. Unless that acid from the stomach start to leak elsewhere. And if you're young, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. When you reach your 40s, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, which is, heartburn that we get, the acid reflux that we get. What is it really? It's acid leaking from the stomach, going to your esophagus or going to your small intestine. That can cause major damage. And we get that, especially when you eat something spicy, something juicy, or sour, like orange juice, lemon, and all this stuff, that contains acidity, and you go to sleep, spices, good luck sleeping at night, because this is where the acid reflux starts. And that acid starts to leak from your stomach into your esophagus, which gives you a discomforting feeling. So it's about the pH. Again, the pH in your stomach that is 1, tolerable in your stomach, not tolerable elsewhere. So in this case, this is when we take Tums, Rolaids, those. What are those? Those are pills that are base to neutralize the acid, or over-the-counter prescriptions, or prescribed medications to control the acidity. So the point I'm trying to make, have we not understood the pH in our body, we would never have designed drugs for it. So knowing about drugs is very important. Sometimes when we use atoms actually to diagnose diseases, to understand diseases. Take, for example, thyroid disease. Hyperthyroid and hypothyroidism, very common diseases now. What are they? The thyroid gland basically produces a hormone called thyroid hormone, which is important for metabolism. We're going to have an extensive lecture on the thyroid gland and the thyroid hormones, the endocrine system later on. So to have someone who's diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, it means they have an overactive thyroid. Someone who has hypothyroidism has an underactive thyroid. So how do you diagnose it? There are lots of techniques used, but one of the common techniques used is to image the thyroid. You want to image it. Image it, the same way someone breaks or have a trauma. Did they break their hand or not? Let's do an x-ray to look at the bones. You want to look at the thyroid activities, say. You don't do x-ray for this. There are techniques. And these techniques are based on using radio-labeled chemicals that can be picked up by an imaging machine. So only if because we want to isolate, we want to image the thyroid gland only. Remember, the thyroid is located under your Adam's apple. Do you remember what was this called in anatomy? Thyroid cartilage, your Adam's apple. It's below it, kind of like a bow tie. So I want an imaging technique to detect only the thyroid gland. I don't want to see the trachea. I don't want to see the larynx. I can care less about them. I want to see the thyroid gland. So by understanding the chemistry, guess what? Your thyroid gland uses the only place in your body that uses iodine, the iodide ion, to synthesize the thyroid hormone. So great. We inject radio-labeled iodine into the patient, and that iodine, we know it's going to end up in the thyroid gland. We expose the patient to a machine like MRI, and we got an image of the thyroid. So see how the chemistry is important? Had we not known that iodide is used by the thyroid, the imaging with this resolution, this is a computerized enhanced resolution of the thyroid gland. Had we not known about iodine, we can never image the thyroid gland. So it's a great technique based on the understanding of the chemistry. Sometimes you have someone who has heart problems. Same idea, you want to image, you want to look at the blood vessels. I don't want to look at everything, I just want to look at the blood vessels. Where are your blood vessels located? Everywhere. You have muscles, you have bones, you have other organs. I just want to enhance and look at an image of the blood vessels in the body with a patient. How do I do this? Well, same idea. We use a chemical, for example. There are many techniques. This technique I chose called digital subtraction angiography. We give the patient a chemical known as xenon, that's radio-labeled, that interacts with the blood. It actually travels in the blood and it's radio-labeled. So we actually now inject or give the patient an inhalation of xenon that travels through your lungs, ends up in the blood, and is radio-labeled, so we can pick it up on the on an MRI or any other machine, imaging machine. And notice, everything in red is blood vessels. Everything yellow is the tissue I don't care about. Your computer software kind of single it out. So look at the blood vessels. Notice how wide this blood vessels. Great. And notice this blood vessel right here. Oops, there's a blockade right here. That patient have fat deposits. And this is basically narrowing of the artery. We call it stenosis. So there is a problem with the blood vessel. And as a result, we know that this patient may have a heart attack. So again, by knowing about the blood vessels, by knowing about the property of the chemistry, and we know xenon can be radiolabeled, it travels in the blood, we got a great image of the blood vessels. Another technique used a lot in pharmaceuticals and drugs. When a pharmaceutical company design a pill, we all take some kind of medications, right? Or most of us do. To make that medication, a pharmaceutical company needs to dissolve to make it in a pill form, so it's solid, so you can grab it in your hand, and it lasts a lot in the vial, in the container. We call it shelf life. But we want to make sure as soon as the patient takes it, it's not like a seed where it remains a seed. As soon as the patient takes it, it dissolves very quickly. So here's a pill, for example, and you put it in water. It needs to dissolve very quickly. Notice how it is dissolving very quickly. How does that work? Well, guess what? They make these pills by making sure there's a lot of ionic bonds, because ionic bonds have this unique property. They're very strong when they're dry in nature, and they're very weak when they interact with water. And that's why you put the pill in your saliva, in your mouth. Saliva, you swallow it. Most of our body is water, and boom, it dissolves. So the chemicals from the drug gets into our blood to do whatever function it has. Again, something we all do. Taking medications is based on chemistry, based on ionic bonds. So that tells you the link between the chemistry and the physiology, something very important to know. So great, that's enough about the atoms. Basic understanding, bonds, molecules. I want to shift our attention to the major biological molecules. And as I said, there are 4 of them: proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. I want to spend a lot of time on this, explaining what they are and how they work. And we'll pick this up in the next